Case number 1 in today's archive is Sean Sellers. On the night of March 5, 1986, a 16-year-old boy moved through a darkened house in northwest Oklahoma City wearing only black underwear. The choice was deliberate. He had thought it through. The underwear would limit blood spatter on himself. He crept into the bedroom where his mother and stepfather lay sleeping, raised a .44 caliber revolver, and fired into each of them. His stepfather died from the first shot. The sound woke his mother and he shot her in the face. He then rearranged the scene to suggest a break-in had taken place. When that was done, he drove to his best friend's house and told him what he had done. Before we go deeper into this case, tell me in the comments, do you believe every death row conviction represents justice, or are some cases too uncertain for that sentence? Sean Richard Sellers was born on May 18, 1969, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised primarily by his mother, Vonda, and her second husband, Lee Belafato. The early years were unstable. The family moved frequently, and Sellers spent stretches of his childhood in a shifting series of homes with little consistency. Friends and teachers described him as intelligent but increasingly withdrawn and disconnected from his peers as he moved through adolescence. By 15, he had developed a deepening obsession with horror films, fantasy role-playing games, and eventually the occult. He began studying Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible and became convinced that Satanism would give him power and control over his life. He performed rituals, claimed to have invoked a demon he called Ezurate, and wrote in his own blood the words, "I renounce God." At his high school, Putnam City North, he brought a Satanic Bible to class, spoke openly about demons, and drank his own blood at rituals he organized with friends. The conflicts inside the Belafato home intensified through 1985. Sellers argued constantly with his mother over his girlfriend, his school performance, and his growing obsession with dark ideology. He later wrote from prison that his hatred for his mother and stepfather had been building for a long time. He attempted to poison his mother by lacing her coffee with rat poison on multiple occasions. It did not work. The first murder did not involve his family. On September 8, 1985, Sellers was 16 years old when he walked into a Circle K convenience store at NW 122 in Council Road in Oklahoma City with his best friend, Richard Howard. The clerk, 36-year-old Robert Paul Bauer, had refused to sell beer to Howard. According to Howard's testimony, Sellers had told him beforehand that he wanted to see what it felt like to kill somebody. Sellers shot Bauer in the store and left. Howard was present but did not participate. Oklahoma City police investigated the killing as a possible robbery gone wrong. It went unsolved. Sellers later confessed from prison that after shooting Bauer, he had laughed, describing the sensation to investigators as being like a fantastic prank. 6 months passed. On the night of March 5, 1986, Sellers carried out the killings he had been planning inside his own home. Dressed only in black underwear, he moved into the bedroom where his mother and stepfather were asleep and shot each of them in the head. He tried to stage the scene as a break-in, then drove to Howard's house and told him what he had done. Howard would later testify against Sellers in exchange for a 5-year suspended sentence, with his own first-degree murder charge dismissed. Investigators connected the Belafato murders to the unsolved Circle K killing through Howard's cooperation and Sellers' subsequent confession. Sellers admitted to all 3 killings. He told investigators he had committed the murders as a practicing Satanist and attributed the acts to demonic influence. He was arrested, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and tried as an adult. At trial, Sellers' defense team built its case around 2 interconnected arguments. Defense counsel portrayed Sellers as a victim of Satanism and occult worship whose judgment had been destroyed by his involvement in dark ideology. They further argued his addiction to Dungeons and Dragons had disconnected him from any awareness of wrongdoing. A psychiatric expert testified that Sellers had been legally unconscious at the time of all 3 killings and was therefore incapable of forming the intent required for first-degree murder. The jury rejected both arguments entirely. For the murders of his mother and stepfather, the state successfully argued the killings were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that Sellers represented a continuing threat to society, and that he had knowingly created a great risk of death to more than one person. He was convicted on all 3 counts and sentenced to death in 1986, at 17 years old. There was a procedural dimension to the sentencing that would later become significant. At the time, Oklahoma law did not give juries the option of life without the possibility of parole. According to one juror who later spoke publicly, the jury believed Sellers would be paroled within 7 to 14 years under a life sentence, and they considered that term insufficient. So they chose death. Following his conviction, Sellers was transferred to H Unit at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, the state's death row facility. Documented records describe cells measuring approximately 7 by 15 feet, with inmates confined to their cells for 23 hours per day on weekdays and 24 hours on weekends. Exercise time consisted of 1 hour per day, 5 days a week, in small concrete yards surrounded by 18-foot walls with no external views. Showers were permitted 3 times per week, 15 minutes each. While confined there, Sellers underwent what he described as a Christian conversion. He authored a book called Web of Darkness, framing his involvement in Satanism as a cautionary tale for young people. He appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show, on a Geraldo Rivera segment about Satanism, and in documentaries for 48 Hours, MSNBC, and the A&E Network. He married a woman in prison on Valentine's Day, 1995, though the marriage was annulled in 1997. His step-siblings publicly doubted the sincerity of his conversion. Prison officials characterized him as a manipulator who performed his Christianity for Christian visitors. Only his step-grandfather and the prison chaplain believed the transformation was genuine. The legal battle over Sellers' execution became one of the most contentious juvenile death row cases in American history. During post-conviction proceedings, a Texas psychiatrist working on Sellers' behalf diagnosed him with multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. The diagnosis came nearly 6 years after his imprisonment. Prosecutors were never required to challenge it in court. When Sellers attempted to introduce this evidence through the appeals process, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals refused to consider it, ruling the claim had been raised too late. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals acknowledged the situation directly in its written ruling, stating that the court was troubled by the extent of uncontroverted clinical evidence proving Sellers suffered from multiple personality disorder at the time of the offenses, and that the offenses may have been committed by an alternate personality. Nevertheless, the court was constrained by the limited nature of federal habeas corpus relief and affirmed the lower court's decision. The panel further observed that while Sellers might be able to prove factual innocence through this diagnosis, he was left to the avenue of executive clemency to pursue that claim. Clemency was denied. The effort to spare Sellers drew international condemnation. The European Union formally objected. Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote to Governor Frank Keating urging commutation, citing international law prohibiting the execution of juvenile offenders. The American Bar Association and human rights organizations including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch all raised objections, citing both his age at the time of the crimes and the unresolved mental illness evidence. Governor Keating responded that he could not act without a recommendation from the Pardon and Parole Board. That board denied clemency. 2 days before his execution, Sellers filed 2 final appeals, one accusing the Pardon and Parole Board of civil rights violations, and another arguing the state appellate court had made a procedural error in ruling he had waived his insanity claim. Both were denied. Sean Richard Sellers was executed by lethal injection at 12:17 a.m. on February 4, 1999, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. He was 29 years old. In his final minutes, he sang a Christian hymn and said loudly, "Here I come, Father. I'm coming home." He was the 512th person executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1977. Of the 12 juvenile offenders executed before him in that period, all had been 17 at the time of their crimes. The last person executed in the United States for a crime committed at age 16 had been Leonard Shockley in Maryland on April 10, 1959. Sean Sellers remains the only person executed in the United States for a crime committed under the age of 17 since the death penalty was reinstated. 6 years after his execution, the Supreme Court's ruling in Roper v. Simmons declared the execution of any offender for a crime committed under the age of 18 unconstitutional, sparing more than 70 juvenile offenders on death rows across the country. Had that ruling come earlier, Sellers would have lived. The case is cited to this day in legal debates about juvenile culpability, mental illness in capital proceedings, and the procedural barriers that can prevent legitimate evidence from ever being tested in court, regardless of what that evidence might establish. Case number 2 in today's archive is Edmund Kemper. In the spring of 1973, the Santa Cruz area of California had earned a designation that no community wants. Journalists had begun calling it the murder capital of the world. 3 separate serial killers were operating in the same region at the same time. Law enforcement was stretched. College students had been warned not to hitchhike alone. And on a near-daily basis, investigators working the case found themselves relaxing after shifts at a local bar called the Jury Room, where a large, friendly, and unusually talkative man named Big Eddie was a regular. He bought rounds. He asked thoughtful questions about how the case was progressing. He seemed to know things. The investigators liked him. They considered him a friend. Edmund Kemper had already killed 8 people by that point. The officers simply had no idea. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. He was the middle child of Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Strandberg. His parents' marriage was volatile and ended in divorce in 1957, after which Edmund was raised primarily by his mother. By every documented account, that relationship was corrosive. His mother subjected him to relentless psychological belittlement, mocking his physical size, his social awkwardness, and his perceived inadequacies. She repeatedly told him that no woman would ever love him. She made him sleep in the locked basement because she claimed to be afraid of him, even as he was still a child. He grew up learning to hate himself, and according to his own later statements, he transferred that hatred steadily outward, toward women in particular. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to find his father in Van Nuys, California. He located him but was rejected and turned away. He was subsequently sent to live with his paternal grandparents on a remote rural property in North Fork, California. He found the arrangement deeply isolating. His grandmother, he later said, was harsh and controlling in a manner he found similar to his mother. His grandfather had taken away his rifle after Kemper began killing small birds and animals on the property, a documented early warning sign that went insufficiently addressed. The rifle was eventually returned to him. On August 27, 1964, at 15 years old, Kemper shot his grandmother in the kitchen after an argument, firing once into her head and twice into her back, then stabbing her multiple times. When his grandfather returned home later that day, Kemper went outside and shot him in the driveway. He then called his mother, who told him to call the police. He did so and waited for them to arrive. When investigators asked him why he had killed his grandmother, Kemper told them he had simply wanted to see what it felt like. Court psychiatrists evaluated him and found his crimes incomprehensible for a 15-year-old. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility in San Luis Obispo County housing mentally ill offenders. What followed in that institution was not a rehabilitation. Kemper's documented IQ tested in the upper ranges. He was articulate, calm, and strategically cooperative. He absorbed information from the psychiatric staff about how evaluations were scored and what responses were considered indicators of progress. He listened extensively to incarcerated sex offenders recount their crimes. He masked what he later described as an escalating inner world of violent sexual fantasy with an outward presentation of model behavior. He was considered an exceptional patient. Against the explicit recommendation of his treating psychiatrist, and reportedly against Kemper's own stated objection, he was paroled in 1969 at the age of 21 and returned to the custody of his mother. He was the same person who had entered that facility. He applied to become a California Highway Patrol officer and was rejected because of his criminal record and his extraordinary physical size. He had grown to 6 feet 9 inches and nearly 300 pounds. He took highway construction jobs. He began driving routes near California University campuses, picking up female hitchhikers, driving with them, and releasing them. By his own account in later FBI interviews, this was preparation. He was rehearsing the process, the pickup, the isolation, the psychological management of a person in a confined space. Then he stopped releasing them. Between May 1972 and February 1973, Kemper murdered 6 young women, all hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area, most of them university students. He picked them up in his car, drove them to remote locations, killed them, and carried out acts of necrophilia and dismemberment that investigators would later describe as among the most disturbing elements of the case. He transported victims' remains in his vehicle. He stored severed heads in his apartment. He socialized regularly with the law enforcement officers actively investigating the very murders he was committing, drinking alongside them at the jury room without their knowledge, and gleaning information about the direction of their inquiry. A UC Santa Cruz parking sticker on his car allowed him to continue picking up student hitchhikers even after campus warnings had been issued telling students to accept rides only from vehicles with that sticker. Prosecutors' experts later told the court, following extensive examination including sessions conducted under truth serum, that Kemper had probably engaged in acts of cannibalism, cooking and eating portions of his victims' remains. These findings were introduced at trial as part of a broader psychiatric evaluation that concluded, despite the extreme nature of his acts, that Kemper had known precisely what he was doing in each instance, had been aware it was wrong, and had been legally sane throughout. In April 1973, Kemper reached what he later described as his ultimate objective, the act he had been building toward for years. On Good Friday, he went to his mother's apartment in Aptos. After a heated exchange, he waited until she went to sleep. He then struck her in the head with a claw hammer and cut her throat. He decapitated her, cut off her hands, and removed her larynx, which he put down the garbage disposal. He hid her remains throughout the apartment, then called his mother's closest friend, Sally Hallett, and invited her over. When she arrived, he killed her as well. He then got in his car and drove east. What followed was one of the most unusual self-surrenders in documented American criminal history. Kemper drove to Colorado, waited, and then called the Santa Cruz police from a payphone to confess. Officers who took the call initially believed it was a prank, Big Eddie calling in one of his jokes. After multiple follow-up calls and the disclosure of specific details only the actual killer would know, they accepted that he was serious. He was arrested without incident and transported back to California. He was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder on May 7, 1973. Defense counsel mounted an insanity plea, pointing to Kemper's prior diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and his documented history of psychiatric institutionalization. Prosecution experts countered that Kemper's capacity for detailed planning, victim selection, scene management, and self-concealment demonstrated full awareness of his actions and their wrongfulness, meeting California's legal standard for sanity. While awaiting trial, Kemper attempted suicide twice by slashing his wrists. The trial began in October 1973. After 3 weeks of proceedings, the jury found him guilty on all 8 counts in early November. When the judge asked Kemper what he believed would be the appropriate punishment for his crimes, he answered that he should be tortured to death. Capital punishment was under a temporary suspension in California at the time of sentencing. He received 8 concurrent life sentences instead. Kemper was transferred to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he has remained incarcerated ever since. Beginning in the mid-1970s, he cooperated extensively with FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas during their foundational research into serial homicide, providing them with detailed accounts of his psychology, his victim selection process, and the internal mechanics of how he had operated undetected for so long. FBI profiler Douglas described Kemper as among the brightest prison inmates he had ever interviewed, with a rare capacity for self-analysis unusual in violent offenders. Kemper's conversations with Ressler also directly changed FBI interview protocol. After Kemper told one agent during a session that in the 30 minutes before the guard returned he could snap the agent's head off and leave it on the table, bureau policy was changed to require all such interviews to be conducted by pairs of agents. Kemper has been denied parole repeatedly throughout his incarceration. He waived his right to appear at several hearings, stating in documented accounts that the world was not ready for someone like him. He was denied parole in 2017. In 2024, after declining to attend his parole hearing, he was denied again. A psychiatric evaluation conducted in April 2024 classified him as high risk to reoffend. He is next eligible for parole consideration in 2031. Reports following the 2024 hearing noted that Kemper was using a wheelchair and had been diagnosed with diabetes and coronary heart disease. The case of Edmund Kemper endures as one of the most thoroughly documented institutional failures in American corrections history. A 15-year-old who killed his grandparents and explicitly stated his motive was to see what it felt like was evaluated, diagnosed, institutionalized, and then, against medical advice, returned to the care of the person whose influence on him had already been identified as deeply damaging. 8 women died in the years that followed. The case also reshaped how the FBI studies violent offenders and contributed to the foundational methodology still used in criminal profiling today, a grim legacy built entirely on Kemper's willingness to explain in meticulous detail exactly what he had done and why. Case number 3 in today's archive is Alyssa Bustamante. On the evening of October 21, 2009, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton left a friend's house in St. Martins, Missouri, a small rural community just west of Jefferson City. She lived 4 houses away from where she had been visiting. She had promised her mother she would be home for dinner. She knew the neighborhood. She knew the people who lived along the route. She did not make it home. A 15-year-old girl who lived just down the street had been waiting. The grave was already dug. It had been dug several days earlier, and it had been dug specifically for this. Alyssa Bustamante was born in 1994 in California. Her early childhood was defined by the collapse of the home she was born into. Her mother, Michelle Bustamante, had a documented history of drug and alcohol abuse that led to criminal charges and incarceration. Her father, Cesar Bustamante, was serving time in prison on assault charges. In 2002, when Alyssa was 7 years old, her maternal grandparents, Gary and Karen Brooke, took legal custody of her and her 3 younger siblings. The family relocated from California to a rural property in St. Martins, Missouri, hoping to provide the children with stability away from what had come before. By outward measures, the arrangement worked for several years. Alyssa became an A and B student at her high school. Friends described her as someone who wrote poems, joked around, and participated in activities at the local Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Her grandparents were described by community members as attentive and caring. But documented warning signs began accumulating around 2007. That year, Alyssa was hospitalized following a suicide attempt. She was placed on antidepressant medication. She was seen by mental health professionals who identified major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. On her public YouTube and MySpace profiles, visible to anyone who looked, she listed her hobbies as killing people and cutting. She posted photographs of herself in dark makeup with what appeared to be fake blood. A former friend later told investigators and the media that Alyssa had pulled her aside at some point and told her, unprompted, that she wondered what it would be like to kill somebody. That conversation was never reported to authorities. The online postings generated no formal intervention. Court records established that Bustamante had dug 2 shallow graves in the wooded area behind her neighborhood in the days before October 21, 2009. Only one was used. On the evening of the killing, she sent her younger sister to Elizabeth Olton's home with an invitation to come play. When Elizabeth arrived in the neighborhood, Bustamante's younger sister brought her toward the woods. Bustamante met them, took Elizabeth separately into the trees, and once they were out of sight, strangled her, sliced her throat with a kitchen knife, and stabbed her 8 times in the chest. She then placed Elizabeth's body in the grave and covered it with leaves. Elizabeth's mother reported her missing when she did not come home for dinner. Law enforcement responded immediately. A community search was organized. Missouri State Highway Patrol and FBI agents were involved within the first 24 hours. The day after Elizabeth was reported missing, investigators searched the Bustamante family home and seized a personal journal from Alyssa's bedroom. The journal entry for October 21, 2009 had been partially scribbled over, but forensic examiners were able to recover the text. It read, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them and now they're dead." In a continuation of that same entry, Bustamante wrote that it was amazing, and that as soon as you got past the overwhelming initial feeling, it was pretty enjoyable. Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Rice later testified that Bustamante told him directly she had wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. Bustamante led investigators to the grave site where Elizabeth's body was concealed under leaves. The forensic examination confirmed the cause of death and was entirely consistent with her account. Bustamante was charged with first-degree murder and tried as an adult. Her defense team presented extensive mental health testimony. Multiple mental health professionals testified that she had major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, and defense counsel argued that her use of the antidepressant Prozac had contributed to violent ideation. Prosecutors rejected that framing directly. They pointed to the fact that she had dug the grave several days before the killing, had used her younger sister to lure Elizabeth out of her home, and had written about the experience in explicitly pleasurable terms immediately afterward. Cole County Prosecutor Mark Richardson told the court that Bustamante had committed the murder after cool deliberation, meaning reflection on the act for any length of time, and that the planning demonstrated adult-like intent that warranted adult-level accountability.